Je vais faire une toute petite introduction en français et ensuite nous allons donc entamer la conversation avec Glenn en anglais. Glenn Brown, artiste britannique comme vous le savez, est l'un des peintres les plus importants de sa génération. Il est né en 1966 à Hexham, dans le Northumberland. C'est un comté au nord-est de l'Angleterre, tout près de la frontière écossaise. En 1982, il termine ses études au Goldsmiths College de Londres. Il souligne lui-même l'importance qu'a eu l'artiste Michael Craig Martin, qui intervenait ces années-là comme enseignant au Goldsmiths. Et qui a eu une grande importance pour un grand nombre de ces artistes qui allaient se faire connaître sous le terme de YBA, Young British Artists. En 1995, il participe à la cinquième exposition des YBA, à la Galerie, et pendant l'été, il a sa première exposition personnelle à Londres, dans une galerie, chez Carsten Schubert, et le Arts Council d'Angleterre, qui est un peu le FNAC, le Fonds national d'art contemporain anglais, acquiert une première œuvre de lui, première peinture. En 1987, il expose à Paris. Chez Guylaine Husneau, je vois qu'il y a beaucoup de personnes jeunes ici ce soir qui ne connaissent peut-être pas très bien la situation des galeries parisiennes dans les années 90 à Paris. En tout cas, la galerie de Guylaine, qui maintenant a été reprise par son fils, était un lieu extrêmement important. Une galerie qui montrait beaucoup d'artistes internationaux. On peut mentionner tout simplement Ronnie Horn, Mike Kelly, Franz West. Elle avait montré Isa Gensken déjà à la fin des années 80. Et donc Glenn trouvait tout naturellement sa place dans cette exposition, dans cette galerie. Qui était une galerie qui ne suivait pas forcément les artistes, c'était souvent une seule exposition, après les comptes étaient faits et ça s'arrêtait là. L'exposition que j'avais vue à l'époque était importante aussi parce que le FRAC Limousin a acquis deux peintures dans cette exposition, deux peintures de 96 qui étaient longtemps les seules peintures de Glenn dans les collections publiques françaises. La même année, donc toujours en 97, il participe à l'exposition Sensation à la Royal Academy de Londres, qui était un peu, je dirais, la consécration des Young British Artists. 98, première expo à Los Angeles, personnelle à Los Angeles chez Patrick Painter, et déjà en 2000, il commence à exposer chez Max Hetzler, qui est la galerie donc à Berlin à l'époque, maintenant Berlin, Paris et Londres, et qui nous reçoit aussi ce soir. Et il est également nominé pour le prix Turner. Pour vous préciser, c'est l'année, Glenn ne l'a pas eu, c'est Wolfgang Tillmans qui l'avait eu cette année-là. 2002, il participe à l'exposition Cher peintre au Centre Pompidou avec plusieurs œuvres. Et en 2004, il a une importante exposition personnelle à la Serpentine Gallery de Londres, accompagné par ce catalogue que vous connaissez peut-être. C'était un des catalogues importants dans sa carrière. Il a également cette année la première exposition chez Gagosian et le Centre Pompidou acquiert une de ses peintures pour sa collection. Ensuite, les expositions continuent. 2008, Kunsthistorisches Museum de Vienne. 2009, Tate Liverpool. Également à remarquer une exposition de gravure, chose peut-être un peu moins connue, dans une galerie, toujours chez Carsten Schubert, chez qui il avait débuté. Et dans cette exposition, il avait travaillé à partir des rampantes d'Urs Graf, l'artiste suisse de la Renaissance beaucoup moins connu, et de Lucian Freud. 2015, il réalise sa toute première exposition de dessin chez Max Hetzler et Samir Saouma ici à Paris. Et en 2016, il a une exposition à la Fondation Vincent van Gogh à Arles. C'est un œuvre complexe et très sophistiquée, non seulement riche en références, mais aussi en irrévérence, je dirais. Et il fait preuve à la fois de beaucoup de sérieux et d'un sens de l'humour tout britannique. Glenn a accepté de répondre à quelques questions et de nous parler de son art. La conversation se fera en anglais, donc brush up your English. Glenn, shall we go back to your youth? If you don't mind. I was wondering, how did it happen that a young man who grew up in the north of England, unless I'm mistaken, ended up at Goldsmith Art School in London?
Well, I grew up in the north of England when I was about 5, and then I moved to the southeast of England from then onwards. But that makes very little difference, because whether it was Newcastle or Norwich I was in, they're both not London. They both have good museums, but didn't really present me with the international art scene in any way. But then in the 1980s, or the early 80s, London was very parochial anyway, and being in London didn't really attach you to an international art scene either, I don't think. So first of all, I went to Norwich School of Art, and then I went to Bath Academy of Art, not wanting to go to London because London seemed like a big scary city, because now I'm a boy from the countryside and art was a very new thing to me. I was brought up with literature but not the visual arts. So eventually I realized, as I became more and more interested in art and sculpture and painting and all of it, that I had to go to London. So then I applied to Goldsmiths and went to London. And never looked back, really. I fell in love with London, I fell in love with museums, and I definitely fell in love with the whole ethos of the way that Goldsmiths taught art, which I thought was very interesting and stimulating.
And how was that? How was the teaching?
Oh, Goldsmiths teaches on a the basis is very much to do with philosophy. You're never going to get taught really about how to use color, how to create composition, how to make the perfect painting. It's not an academic college in any way. It doesn't teach academic painting, and hasn't for a very long time. It's giving you the sort of rudimentals of philosophy and post-structuralist theory, particularly. It was then, and probably still is to some degree, its ethos. It's teaching about the language of art, and the fact to be a good artist, you have to learn its language and have to understand that it's a shared way of communication first and foremost. And therefore, teachers like Michael Craig Martin and Gerard Hemsworth, who was the head of the Masters when I was there, are teaching you very much that you are communicating to a public, and therefore you have to understand how the public are reading and interpreting your work, because it might not be necessarily how you intend it. And it's no good as an artist just to say, well, this is me expressing myself. How anybody interprets it doesn't matter. It's what comes from my heart and my soul. They would say, rubbish. If somebody interprets it in a different way than you intended, then that is the work. It's It's a form of communication. And if you're communicating badly, then understand it and change it and adapt and learn and just be aware of the world that surrounds you.
All right. But at the same time, you are, in a certain sense, classical painter. Where did you learn about the physicality of painting, if I can say so?
Well, I came from a very conceptual background. Well, the first part of my education was very much academic. It was a lot of hours spent in the life drawing room, doing drawings from plaster casts and from life models and drawing in the landscape. So I did my fair share of that to start with. And then at Bath and then at Goldsmiths, it was a much more conceptual understanding. And it was a time when a lot of American artists like Jeff Koons and Haim Steinbach and Mayer Weissman, Cindy Sherman, Barbara Kruger were coming through. And it was a sort of second run of conceptual art. And Neo-Geo and postmodernism, which was very much the trend. And Gerhard Richter and artists like Sigmar Polke were a big influence on me. Artists that used, like Jeff Koons, who used media, who used the photograph as the starting point for work. So I was very influenced, as I said, by Gerhard Richter, and therefore I threw a lot of the sort of academic understanding of how to make a painting out the window and started to try to understand how photography had changed painting and how painting existed within the world of multimedia and postmodern culture generally. At which point in order to make this point of why I was still, there was one tutorial I did and one of the other students said, why are you making paintings? If they're all based on photographs that you're making, why not just take a photograph of the photograph? If you want to make a conceptual point, why paint it? Why spend hours and hours making the paintings you make? And I said, well, that's good. How do I answer that? And my way of answering it was to say, well, I'm going to paint. And so I go looking for models in which to paint, and I came to the conclusion that Karel Appel, Willem de Kooning, and Frank Auerbach were probably the thickest painters. You know, they applied the paint thicker than anybody else, and therefore, if I was going to paint, I would choose artists who put more paint on the canvas than anybody else. It's a pretty dumb answer to a dumb question, but they were my subject matter to start with, and they're all to a certain extent expressionist painters, and therefore the subject matter of my very dry conceptual paintings based on photographs was expressionist painting. So I was hitting expressionist painting head on with my conceptual head on, and from that point onwards, that's when things start to sort of slowly change in my work as I start to realize that I have to take account of things like expression and composition and color and three-dimensional form and all the academic things that artists and painters have been looking at for centuries.
The three painters you mentioned, de Kooning, Appel and Auerbach, they were all living at that time?
Yes.
Was that...
I think he drank himself into oblivion before then, yes.
Yeah, but still, I mean, they were really contemporary artists. Did you contact them, or did you just go ahead and work after their work? I remember I think you did 3 paintings on after the Karel Appel at Tate, taking details every time.
I didn't contact them. I was a student at the time, and it didn't feel that what I was doing was of any great importance, so I didn't feel the need to contact anybody. Also, it was in an age when copyright didn't seem to be of any importance, and information and images flowed freely in a way that perhaps they don't in the age of the internet, because people are slightly more aware of copyright, and even though images are much more easily accessible now than they were before, sort of people are slightly sharper on that. Which brings me slightly to a point that I did hit problems with certain artists when I started making work based on science fiction painters, because they didn't consider themselves necessarily as artists, but as illustrators, and they didn't like their copyright being infringed. And at that point, I realized that even though I was very influenced by a lot of German and American art, I then find out that the copyright laws in Germany and America are not the same as they are in England. The copyright laws in France aren't the same as they are in England. England's one of the very few countries in the world where, as an artist, you can't take another piece of work, another artist's work, and comment on it visually. In most other countries, you can do that. And you, as long as you tell somebody that, as long as you write on the title that this work is after the particular artist, and make it very known that you're using the work and making a visual comment on the original work, you can do that. In England, you can't. And that caused a problem and nearly caused me to leave England. So, yeah.
I've noticed that from the early years on, already you had quite an extended knowledge of art history and of the history of painting. Did you learn about that at Goldsmith as well, or was that your personal interest, or how did this come along?
No, I didn't study. Whenever the sort of history of art parts of being an art student came up, and sort of should I study art history or philosophy or literature, I tended to go for philosophy and literature as the sort of add-on bit. So academically, I never really learned a great deal about art history, but of course, all the time I'm looking and reading and visiting museums and slowly accruing my understanding of art. And whenever I travel, the first place I want to go is the museum and the gallery. It's one of the most entertaining things I find to do. Is my natural habitat is in a museum. I think I'm never, maybe probably slightly happy in an artist studio, which is why I like being in this room or in my own studio. But then my second happiest place is in a museum, because to me it's just an exciting box of chocolates, and it involves time travel and wonder and communication, and I just find it, I love museums. I love what they offer to people freely in most cases.
Yes, I understand fully what you're saying. What also seems to appear is that your taste or your knowledge has evolved naturally over the years, and the references today are much more sophisticated and complex than maybe the references of some of the earlier work. I remember there's one of your famous paintings is based on a Dali painting, and now you quote Gandolfi, you quote much lesser known artist, proving more refined knowledge of the history of art.
Not that I'd be disparaging towards Dali. I think he's very underrated, especially as a draftsman. But I understand what you mean in that I slowly start to learn about the history of art, and particularly when I started to discover Italian Mannerist art and Northern European Mannerist artists. You mentioned Gandolfi there particularly. And I realized how so many aspects of contemporary work had already been done. They were sort of surrealism and expressionism, abstraction. They were already doing in the 17th century or early 18th century. And there's so many aspects in old master drawings and paintings which, if you look at them closely, are far more stimulating than an awful lot of artists of the 21st century managed to produce. They were artists who maybe spent their entire lives just doing drawing or just doing printmaking. And it was their lives depended on this, and you can tell that in their work. You can tell the fascination, also the competition between artists was making them produce strange work. And you think of old master paintings as being dry and sort of academic and dull, and the further you look, they realize nothing could be further from the truth. They're surreal and strange and challenging and bizarre in a way that most contemporary artists can only dream of.
It's interesting what you say about mannerism and mannerist artists. It's also funny because another painter who has a great knowledge of art history, I'm thinking of Georg Baselitz, is particularly interested in mannerist prints and has a fantastic collection of mannerist prints and drawings back home, which have been shown several times. It seems, in fact, easier to establish connections, as you said yourself, to older masters. At some point, some critics compared your work to the work of John Cohen, the American painter. I must say I have my doubts about that, but how do you see it yourself?
Why do you think they compared me to John Cohen?
Well, certain of his paintings at one point seem to refer to Hans Baldung. And in that case, you could maybe establish a comparison, a point of comparison. But his interests, to me, seem so totally different from, and actually very far from what you are doing and what you are saying with your painting.
I like John Cohen's paintings, and I agree that there are certain points of reference when it appeared that he was referencing art historical paintings, but he seemed to veer away from that in a way that, sort of, if I was to be very blunt about it and probably completely wrong in many ways, I would say that I would typify certain American figurative painters from the 1990s, like Lisa Yugoslav and Elizabeth Peyton, as well as John Cohen. I would say that they're probably slightly more interested in what they paint rather than how they paint it. Whereas if I would look at British artists of the same period, like Chris Ofili or Peter Doig, I'd probably say that we're slightly more, possibly myself, I'd say we're slightly more interested in how we paint something rather than what we're painting. Isn't it? The subject matter isn't necessarily that important. It's the manner and style and colour and composition which you use to actually predict the things, which possibly makes the Americans slightly more illustrative in what they're doing. But that's a very big generalization, obviously.
Obviously, yes. But tell me, how about the relation between title and artwork? For instance, there's one of your Flower Still Lives, which is called Kill Yourself. And there's a Greco-esque portrait called Sex, and a portrait of a woman revealing her breasts, which is called Led Zeppelin. How does this work title and artwork?
Well, the nicest quote I have about titles is Duchamp saying that adding a title to a work is like adding an extra color. It's adding something which just isn't there in the first place. It's adding another layer to something, and it's like adding an invisible element to a work. That why would you not do that? Why would you not make a work richer, more eloquent, more poetic than it could be without a title? I mean, sometimes it feels that untitled is all a work needs, obviously in certain cases, but I tend to think untitled is a bit of a cop-out, and therefore I want to add that extra colour to the work. In the case of the painting Kill Yourself, it's based on some Renoir flowers, which I've made the colours very putrescent. There's smoke rising from them. They look pretty much the most miserable flowers you can imagine. And the Kill Yourself thing, I wanted the flowers to convey this sense of, I'm dying, you've cut me, I'm in a vase now, slowly dying, and you're watching me die. Come join me. You've done this to me, I want you to do it to yourself. And so, not that I want the title to be illustrative of the work, because that interpretation would probably take quite some time for somebody to get there. But sometimes, you know, if you see Kill Yourself on it, it's who's saying that? Is it the flower saying it to me? Is it, so, or you're saying it to yourself? And anyway, it has poetic meaning. The painting Sex, it's actually based on a Van Dyck painting, but I've made it look more El Greco by elongating it and changing the color. So you're right in saying that it's more El Greco than Van Dyck. It's called Sex because when I at certain points of doing the painting, I look at them and go, what the hell is this going to be called? Sometimes the title's there at the beginning, sometimes it's not right until the end. And in that case, I was struggling for something to call this painting. It's a man with a very blue face, elongated, looking rather miserable, with a red nose. And I thought, sex. What's the opposite of, you know, what's the opposite of what this painting makes me think of? Well, it doesn't make me think of sex, so sex. And as soon as I thought of the word sex, I just laughed. And you look at his face and you think, sex. And it's funny. It's the opposite. And often the title is the exact opposite of what you expect to think when you're looking at the painting. And therefore, it really does add this whole element of something which is not there. It's that invisible colour that you're adding again. And in case of Led Zeppelin, it's based on Guido Reni, that painting. And in the Guido Reni, the woman's looking to heaven and looking rather ecstatic. And if you're listening, somebody of that age, sort of young woman in the 1970s, listening to Led Zeppelin, having taken something to help her get to the right place, she would have exactly that expression on her face. And I like the idea of art being time travel. And what Rembrandt, what is somebody being painted by Rembrandt, a young boy, or what is somebody being painted by Guido Reni or Andrea del Sarto, what they were thinking when they were being painted could be very similar to what somebody would be thinking if they were painted in the 20th century. You're thinking about being hungry, you're thinking about sex, you're thinking about love and hate and jealousy and greed, and those fundamental things, just in spite of technology, don't change enormously, I think, or I hope they don't. So that's what the titles are sort of pushing you towards, thinking there's a sort of universal thought processes that have been going on throughout the ages.
But this is also where your particular sense of humor hits in, I would say.
Well, the sense of humor is in the paintings as well, hopefully. I mean, taking the head off somebody and presenting them as this blue ghostly figure is sort of a sense of black humor as well. So the titles have a sense of black humor, and the paintings themselves, I think, have this black humor involved in them. Sometimes the painting, the title is slightly illustrative, but not too much so. It's meant to be slightly mysterious. Sometimes somebody has to go away, I would say, and do their homework, but you don't need that in the age of Google. You just put the title in Google. And before I come up with any title now, I have to read what Google says about it, because it's gold now, isn't it?
Something totally different. I mentioned before that you had a show with engravings about 10 years ago. Would you mind explaining how you worked with engravings, and do you still work with printmaking, or how's that?
Yes, about 10 years ago, I decided I'd been looking at so many prints that I wanted to do some myself. And it was at a point when I didn't feel comfortable about drawing. So these early prints I made are made quite photographically. They're taking, in that exhibition, I had work based on Rembrandt and Lucian Freud and Urs Graf. And I'd taken their photographs of their prints and put them in a computer and layered them on top of each other, turned them back to front and twisted them round on the computer so to fit together in particular ways, and then turned them back into etchings. So they're much more conceptual in the way that they come about. There isn't me doing any hand drawing on them at all. My hand is not there. It's invisible. So it's, but I was happy to do it that way. I was trying to show that the prints that were from have been reproduced in the etching plate as well. So you can, if you look closely enough, you can see that they're based on photographic or lithographic plates from a book. And that it was merely me sort of changing, altering, computing, and layering them, more importantly, because in the cases of some of the Rembrandts, you had, I think the maximum was about 15 different etchings laid one on top of the other, so you end up being pretty black at the end. And we used different etching plates. We figured out that you could do 4 etching plates, printing one on top of the other, before the ink just started to lift off because it got too thick. Other than that, you had to use a computer to layer things together. But then I did these more photographic etchings, and then thought, well, where do I take it now? And that's when I started drawing, which was only about 6 or 7 years ago. I really started drawing. It's something that I used to tell other artists to do. I used to go to their studio and say, well, the composition of your painting isn't really working so well. How can we resolve it? It feels unbalanced, or my eye needs to move in a particular direction, and it's not. I would tell other artists, you need to do a drawing of this painting to help you sort out the composition, which is something I didn't do myself. I would just try and sort out the composition on the canvas without doing any pre-drawing. At which point I said, well, look, I have to start drawing, because I keep telling other people to do it and I'm not doing it myself. So one day I went in the studio and said, today I am absolutely going to start drawing. And I did. I just did some drawing. And then the next day I went in and said, well, I'm going to draw again. And then the next day after that. And 3 years later, I made no paintings. I just spent 3 years just drawing. And the early drawings are rubbish. But that's okay. I was learning. And again, I went back to paintings. And now I did the same again for another 3 years. I just stopped painting and I've gone back just to do drawings, which led on to doing etchings again. And now the etchings are done with me drawing again. But drawing sometimes in the etching plate, sometimes just drawing on an iPad, which is wonderful because in an iPad you can flip things back to front, you can change the scale, you can erase things which you can't do on a copper plate. So I found the iPad, and when Apple came out with the iPad Pro and the Apple Pencil, it changed my life in terms of drawing, because the resolution of it was so good that you can draw something, with particular programs, you can draw something and then blow it up to the size of a billboard without losing any resolution, without having pixels. And so I like technology, but I like drawing and hand painting and bits of paper and ink and paint and just as much. So some of the drawings and etchings I do are done using the iPad, and some of them are done on bits of paper with ink pens and smudgy pencil and things. So I like being able to do a bit of both. And the etching process is carried on, and I still have made a whole series of etchings, again, based on Rembrandt, and then other ones combining different artists together, often layered images and very complex. But that feeds very much into the drawings that I do. It's very similar. They look very similar to the drawings.
But both your drawings and your paintings are very physical. So at least this first printing process was extremely different. As you say, you didn't actually touch the work yourself. It was all done through a computer. If you look like a drawing like this one, this is you had your first show of drawings in 2015 here in Paris with Samia Salma and Max Hetzler in the Galerie. And this was one of the drawings which was in the show, as far as I remember. And it's based on Delacroix, based on a print after Delacroix. And was this the first time you were inspired? You worked on a drawing or a painting by Delacroix?
There is some preceding drawings I made based on Delacroix that just precede that by about a year or two. And that's not the actual work that was in the show in Paris before. It's a very similar work, but I made various versions as I sort of tilt and altered the object around. It's two men on horseback that it's based on. And I liked its abstract qualities. The etching, which is here, you can see, and to some extent that sort of turned sideways and elongated and stretched and pulled around, so you no longer see the actual figures. Hopefully you just draw the abstract animation of it. But it's about the fourth drawing I did based on Delacroix, and which led on to me being more interested in Delacroix. And then when I was in Berlin in the National Gallery, I saw the painting that Die Mutter here is based on, and fell in love with it. I fell in love with the brushstrokes and the strangeness of the way he was depicting flesh, most importantly, and this sort of alienated figure standing in the background. It's a portrait. It's a similar size life painting to this one here. It probably would have been made at a very similar time, I think, but it's obviously a female model. Not the same model as appears in the painting behind you. I think she's a different woman. But in some sense, they're very dry academic studies, these two small paintings, but the brushstrokes in them, when you look closely, are very lively, like Delacroix tended to do. He sort of knew how to manipulate paint to create a certain sort of fleshiness that goes slightly beyond, it goes quite a long way beyond realism. He was expressionist artist before his time, really, before the time of expressionism. He was managing to get and to understand the way that the brushstroke and the oil paint and brush marks within a figure animate it, and they create depth, and they create this sort of lusciousness and softness that only oil paint and only a brush can really quite manage to capture in that way.
Yes, but in this particular painting, the painting of Mademoiselle Rose, is that the title? It's not, to me at least, it's not so much the romantic expressionist artist which Delacroix was gonna become, but more somebody who had looked at David, probably through one of his early masters. In this case, it has still has a very neoclassical aspect, but still this speaks to you. I mean, you also use this figure in the blue nude, or is this a coincidence?
This painting's based on a painting that's in Berlin.
In Berlin, that's the one.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's
Yeah.
the one you mentioned.
So it's a similar-sized Delacroix painting in Berlin, and yes, I can see that these sort of David and Ingres are sort of models for what he's doing here, but fundamentally he's a different sort of painter. He's not as academic. His drawing isn't as tight and Delacroix's drawing isn't as precise and tight as Ingres or David. He wasn't really interested in academic modelling, and I think in that way there was always more of a wild character sort of bubbling underneath, and I think that sort of starts to subtly show even in these academic studies. One thing I'd like to point out to them is that one of the nice reasons that this room is red is that Delacroix used it in his work. Because if you look at these two life drawings, the backgrounds are obviously this sort of dull green colour, but if you look at the figures themselves, you can see red reflected. So, and you'll see that in a lot of Delacroix paintings, the fact that he's using the red that's reflected from this room to create depth and space within his on this model. And it's very particular. You can only do it if you've sat in a red room. So if you're wondering why Delacroix had a red studio, you can see it in his paintings.
At one point, you used colored walls for your exhibitions as well, but for a different reason, I gather. Not really. I mean, I think that in the 19th century, Delacroix would have never put paintings on a white wall. It just would have been an odd thing to do. It sort of, for the studio to be white would have made no sense. For the walls in an exhibition to be white would make no sense. It was white walls in exhibition spaces was a fashion in the late 20th century, I would say. And everybody used to think that you could only have white walls in an exhibition. And I think things have changed now, where lots more galleries and artists walk in a space and go, okay, what colour should the walls be? It's just because they're white now doesn't mean to say they have to stay that way. And fundamentally, I'm trying to make the paintings look more interesting. I'm trying to change the context of them. And having a coloured wall is a way of reflecting on the paintings. It's a way of drawing your eye in. It's a way of making the whites pop out. It creates more depth. It looks like you're looking through a window into a different world rather than something on a flat wall which always somewhat remains an object sitting on the wall and doesn't invite you to enter the space beyond the picture plane. And so it's to do with composition and colour, and that's why, and in the same way that putting the frame around a work creates a context for the painting, I'm trying just to change the context in which you see the particular paintings in. This was going to be my next question, the frames, because I've noticed that you have developed a very distinguished taste for antique frames, which is something rather new, I think. When did that start, and is it only this idea of changing the access, the visual access to the work, or is it also an interest, passion maybe for the crafts, for the frames themselves? I mean, there are some very fine examples of. I think this is a Mannerist Italian frame. There are different frames here. Would you say a little more about that?
In 2017, I was asked to do an exhibition in the Museo Stefano Bardini in Florence, and they have a wonderful collection of Renaissance Italian frames, and I realized it would be interesting to fill some of the frames, and so I had some existing drawings and I tried to make them fit certain of the frames, but then realized that that didn't work very well because the frames were very particular sizes and some of them were oval, in order to get this whole process to work, because there were about 40 frames we had on the wall, although we brought it down to a slightly smaller number, about 25, I made work specifically for the frames, because these frames were absolutely gorgeous, and they were there and they were empty, and I thought, I can't do an exhibition with empty frames hanging on the wall. And so I started this process of doing drawings for the frame, the starting point being the frame, and I just enjoyed it. It was just, it adds an extra layer, it's stimulating, it makes you do things that you wouldn't normally do, it makes you think about the scale of the work, it makes you think about the detail, the sense of movement in the particular frames, the color of the frame, the sense of bulkiness the frame might have, or the delicacy the frame might have. So you take on aspects of the frame, the sense of humor even that the frame has in terms of having these little figures in it. And a lot of, partially because of that exhibition, my taste for frames is very much Italian and very much Renaissance. I realized all the way through the sort of 17th, 18th and 19th century, the French were making the best picture frames. I think everybody would acknowledge that the French frame was the quality of it was much higher than in the Italian or English frames. But there's something, maybe like in the Italian character, that's a bit awkward, a bit, again, generalization, but a bit sort of more flamboyant and vulgar and entertaining in the Italian frames that just I find I want to put in my work, and therefore it's pretty much only Italian frames that I've used. The English frames aren't as good quality, and the French frames are slightly more uptight and perfect. The Italian frames leave room for movement in them. They have little accidents, they're slightly asymmetrical. The gilding is a bit sort of wonky, and I like their sense of warmth that they have. And so I'm using that sort of Mannerist Italian feel in the frame to sort of bring out that same sensibility in my work. But yes, all of the works here that are in antique frames, that the work has been made specifically for that frame, and they've become the one piece of art. The frame is now a part of the artwork, and as I said, it's just I'm fundamentally an appropriation artist, and I'm therefore just appropriating the frame in the way that I'm appropriating the Guido Reni or Andrea del Sarto or Raphael drawing. It's just another artist I'm bringing into this party.
In quite a few of the works that you chose to show here, you seem to be somewhere in between painting and drawing, using a drawing-like technique, but with acrylic paint and on either cardboard or wood. For instance, these two large panels, but also some of the smaller drawings. Is this something that has come out of your experience with drawing on paper, or how did you come to this very new, to me at least, very new and very personal technique?
Well, for a long time I've been wanting to meld because I get obsessed with drawing and I don't want to make paintings when I start drawing. And because I've been painting for the last 35 odd years, and sort of drawing is new, and I don't know how to do it, and it's confusing and interesting. So, but I miss colour, and I miss oil paint, and I miss the delicacy of smokiness and softness that oil paint can create. So I've been trying to combine the painting and the oil paint together, the painting and the drawings together. And so these paintings are both acrylic paint and they have oil paint on them as well. And sort of whether you consider them to be a painting or drawing, I don't know. Maybe I don't really care whether it's a drawing or a painting. Certainly the work I'm working on in the studio now has even more oil paint on. There's more of the drawing covered over by layers of oil paint. And they look far more like a cross between the drawings and the paintings. Not that I want there to be a hierarchy between painting and drawing. I don't want to feel that one is secondary to the other. One of the things I find almost painful is that when you walk around a museum like the National Gallery in London or the Louvre to quite a large extent, you're presented with paintings and no drawings. And the drawings are taken out on special occasions. And yes, I do understand that you can't show drawings because of daylight fading reasons, but most museums just don't want to show them, even though they can. And to me, it's just very helpful to an audience who may be slightly confused by what they're looking at and how the artist came up with this idea and what the starting point was. If you can show an audience the drawings that maybe led to a painting, or maybe they're just drawings in their own right, you start to get closer to what the artist was thinking when they made the work. And so when a museum like the Pompidou or the Tate Gallery in London or the Louvre or the National Gallery do an exhibition, I think I want to see drawings. I want to see that blockbuster exhibition with loads of drawings in it, because it just helps the audience get into the frame of mind of the artist. Because, like it or not, I think very often a drawing is much closer to the spirit and the soul of the artist than a painting is. There's less interference, there's less technique, and there's just a drawing is closer to the hand. It represents, it's like a signature. It's like the signature of a person. It's like your handwriting. It's like the way you use words, your accent. The drawing, just using line or just using black and white, is closer to the true nature of an artist. There's nothing to hide behind. There's no clever paint techniques. There's no strange colours. There's just you, the hand, the ink, or the pencil, and your thought processes. And a drawing is a beautiful thing that the public should see far more of, I think. What do you think?
I totally agree, but my experience is that when you suggest to those who decide to make a drawing exhibition, they say, but no paintings, no sculpture, nobody will come and see it.
And do you think they don't want to come and see it because of the scale of the work, or surely it's not the media itself?
No, I mean, I totally agree with you. I'm a drawing man, but often the people who have the last word on a on a museum exhibition program. They are not necessarily the art historians. They are not the ones who actually know. They look at attendance numbers. They get reports about what people are supposed to like or not to like, and they judge from that. And then out goes the drawing, or the drawing is reduced to smaller spaces, more remote spaces, because supposed to not to attract the as many visitors as a painting or a sculpture or photography or what do I know exhibition.
But I mean, you know very well that artists never stop drawing. I think, to a large extent, audiences think that contemporary artists don't draw, but nothing could be further from the truth. Contemporary artists absolutely draw, and there's lots of beautiful drawing going on, but it just doesn't get shown. And to me, it just seems a great pity, because there's a whole plethora of wonderful, strange images out there that people have yet to discover. And yeah, hopefully things will change. You never know. I don't know how.
There's one aspect of your work which we haven't talked about yet. It's the sculpture. There's a fine example of your sculpture here in the show. The show, which to me seems a way of rendering homage to the studio, because you brought a lot of works. During visitors' hours, this drawing is out in the space, and you really feel like you are in an artist studio with all this. The sculpture here on the right side is, I think, can you call it a typical example of your sculpture? What should I say? The heart of it is a reduced model of a French sculpture from the second half of the 19th century, a bronze reduction. And to that you apply paint, but it is a sculpture that you produce, right?
Yeah, it's a found sculpture. It's an antique sculpture. In certain cases, I have got the antique cast, because I haven't wanted to destroy the original, because there weren't many of them made. In this case, it is actually an antique cast, because they were made in quite large numbers. It was very famous in its time, and there were large amounts of them. I didn't feel it was being too destructive to paint over it. If somebody wants the original back, they can take the paint off. That's fine. Because I would say that I'm not trying to be disrespectful to the artist who made it, but then, as I said, he probably didn't do the modelling on the small version of it anyway. It would have been done by somebody else. He would have concentrated on making the larger versions. So, yes, this is an addition, very much a sort of addition or multiple. And what I'm trying to do is to create contrast to a large degree. The original is bronze, whereas I've added paint to it. So you've got the difference of sculpture versus painting. The original has no colour other than the colour of bronze, and mine is all about colour. So you've got the colour and the colourless. Again, the bronze is very hard. And my oil paint is very soft. It's very delicate, hence why it's covered. The original is very figurative. And what I've added to it is pretty abstract. You could say that they're figurative elements, but they're quite hard to see. So you've got all these complete opposites. You've got these two opposites of painting and sculpture colliding together and having a fight. Or are they making love? I'm not quite sure. Whatever's going on inside the oil paint there is you're meant to be, your imagination is meant to make up the missing bits. But yes, it's this sort of almost sort of comic, tragic interplay between sculpture and painting that I'm trying to make in these things. But also, my paintings are about expressionist painting. Even though they're incredibly flat and I may spend hours and hours painting them in great delicacy, what I'm fundamentally painting is expressive brushstrokes. So the subject of my painting is the expressive brushstroke, and even the drawings replicate this feeling of expressive brushstrokes. So the sculptures in some sense represent the oppressed expressive artist, the oppressed expressionist. And it all comes out, and so these are paintings that are where the paint becomes so thick that they become sculptures, which is very much the point. I think of them as paintings, not really as sculptures, because I can feel the same thought processes going on in my head, the same neurons are firing when it comes to me creating them. It's just that rather than standing in front of a flat canvas, I'm walking around a three-dimensional object, but fundamentally I have to get the composition to work, I have to get the color relationships to work, and I have to get your eye to bounce around the object in exactly the same way as I do when it's a painting. It's just that I have to walk around and do that in 3 dimensions. So to me, it's a 3-dimensional painting with all the same compositional devices going on that a painting has to have.
Thank you very much. Maybe we should ask the audience if there are questions.
Thank you. I was wondering, what were the biggest obstacles you had to overcome in your career as a contemporary artist? And secondly, how you intellectually critique a current cultural production that's visually very different from yours. Thank you.
The obstacles. What quite do you mean by obstacles? What do you imagine obstacles might be? Okay. Well, I can't say. The art world is a very open place. You're allowed to do pretty much anything you like, and maybe in some sense it's not too open. It's great that I think you can call anything art. You can film, video, putting a bottle on a table. It's all art, and I think that's wonderful. It's something there to stimulate people and to make them think, and I think art, it's very good that all of the academic constraints to some extent have been thrown off, and as an artist you can create anything. Obviously, the problems arise when you throw everything out the window, all academic study gets thrown out the window and all constraints get thrown out, and sort of, oh, what am I going to do? And it makes lots of artists sort of sit in their studios or wherever they're sitting and panic and go, well, I can't do anything. It's a blank canvas, and that canvas that you're presented with as an artist now is blanker than it's ever been, because the possibilities are greater than they've ever been. But I wouldn't, so in terms of obstacles, I would say that the lack of obstacle becomes the obstacle, if that makes sense. Because freedom is, complete freedom, which obviously we don't have complete freedom, but there's a greater freedom now, and that's difficult. As a student of painting in the 1990s, I quickly realized that creating art is a game, and it's a competitive game to some extent as well, because you're competing with all the other artists in the world, because you just have to go online or look at the catalogue, and whether it's an artist working in Africa, Brazil, China, there's a lot of competition out there, and people will look everywhere, and you have to, as an artist, you have to put your hand up and say, look at me, I'm interesting, I've got something interesting to say. And that's very difficult, because everybody else is shouting, look at me, I'm interesting, I'm more interesting than they are. And so what do I do to make myself stand out? And that, in some sense, seems like, well, that's a cynical thing for an artist to think, but how else are you supposed to think as an artist? I want my art to be seen. I don't want to paint it in my studio and then to put it in a cupboard and it's never seen again. I want to take part in this contemporary culture and contemporary art world. So one of the games you have to play is to make something that people feel they haven't seen before. Or that they feel they're not seeing in other places, and that it is different from other artists. So one of the conundrums I have is, how do I create something that people feel is completely new, whilst referring to artists of the past? So to some extent, that's what I decided was my goal, that I was going to take things that already existed, and I was going to represent them in a way that people had never seen before. People have never seen a Delacroix look quite like that Delacroix. They haven't seen a blue one on that scale, with that sort of strange sense of humor added to it, with these very flat brush strokes. The drawings, again, I sort of use other artists' drawings, but nobody makes drawings quite like I do. They have a particular technique and layering and softness of line that is very particular to me. So the reason you say a lot of the contemporary art world is not interested in academic drawing. So I think, well, let's present academic drawing to them and see what they make of it. And I'm trying to present things to the contemporary art world that they're not used to seeing in any other places, because it's the only way I can think of trying to get people to be interested in it. And it's very difficult in some sense, because the contemporary culture has made a decision at sort of beginning of the 20th century that it really didn't like academic art anymore, and it wanted to get rid of it all, and academic art and drawing and composition was old-fashioned, and all artists have to be amateur artists from now on. And so if you look at any successful artist from the latter half of the 20th century, you will see large elements of the amateur and large elements of the outsider art brought in. And I mean, I'm talking all artists. It's become a rule that you have to be outsider and you have to be non-academic. You have to be the amateur. And I have to follow those rules as well, because if you step outside of them, nobody pays any interest. But I'm trying to slowly bring composition, academic drawing in a way that people feel that they can look at and has enough traits of the amateur in there for them to allow themselves to consider it to be fashionable still. It's a slightly larger argument I'm putting forward than I probably have room to talk about now, but I think maybe you understand what I'm trying to say. What do you think? The idea of the sort of 20th century being dominated by the amateur, or the fake amateur, as I put it. Artists have to pretend to be amateur, otherwise they get ignored.
Thank you, and thank you for this lovely talk. I've got a number of questions, so do ignore any you don't want, and maybe just pick one. My first question is, you work from existing images. What are your thoughts about those who still work from life? Do you think there's a place for people working from life and what they're making nowadays with the way that art's going? Just if you could speak to working from life. My second question is, have you ever met Auerbach, whose work you've used so often as reference for your own, and if so, how did that meeting go? And thirdly, I've looked at your work a lot over the years, and it always strikes me that there's something very much about entropy in there. That might just be my thing, but I wondered if you could talk about entropy as a concept in your work a little bit. Thank you.
The first question was working from life. Is there a role from artists working from life? Well, yes, of course there's a role from artists working from life. It's very important. I think everybody, not just artists, but everybody should do a stint in the life room, drawing from the model, or out in the landscape drawing, because it teaches, especially children, at a very young age, it can teach you that you have to translate something, that to work from life, you have to translate the three-dimensional object into 2 dimensions if you're doing a drawing. And that's a very interesting intellectual game for anyone to play, whether they're a visual artist or not, that they have to translate one thing into another, one language into another language, the language of visually looking at something and understanding what you're seeing in 3 dimensions into the language of 2 dimensions. And it helps a child understand that language is important and translation is important, and to transmute something from one form to another is a very interesting process, and that they can have very individual, that nobody has exactly the same way of doing it as well is a very important thing to learn, that you put 2 people together and they try and do the most accurate life drawing they can, and they'll both look quite radically different. So it teaches you that sense of individuality that you really can't get rid of, which can be a very rich vein in life, that everybody has something to say. Because in life drawing, you will always put something in a very individual, very characterful way, whether you like it or not. So it's something that I think everybody should be doing at school. And they can carry on doing it as well. The problem is that I think even Delacroix, to some extent, would consider these 2 paintings as being studies, as not being full-blown works of art. Fundamentally, he was just doing these to learn from, to have models in which to make paintings from. So perhaps there's limits to that relationship of sitting in a life room working from a model. It's not real life, and it's a very particular artificial environment, and it's very nice if artists can bring themselves out of that environment sometimes, as Frank Auerbach does, because he travels the streets of London and has artists visiting the studio, has lots of different artists has lots of different sitters that he knows very well. And they're very particular portraits of very particular people and very particular places that he's painting. I haven't actually met him. I've written to him. We've communicated by letter. He doesn't really... I've made many works based on his, and even the sculptures particularly that I still make are very much based on his paintings. For example, you learn after looking at his work for a while, he only uses one size of brush to make all of his, for each painting, he uses one brush and one size, and it creates a certain sense of rhythm within the painting. It's quite a strange thing to do for an artist, just use one size of brush in the whole painting. It's a very odd constraint, and it's not obvious to some extent, because sometimes he twists the brush on its side and sometimes it's flat on. But it gives him a very particular style, very particular vocabulary to do that. And I borrowed that vocabulary in the sculptures, because again, they're made just with one size of brush. With the idea, what do you mean by saying that the idea of entropy? Would you like to expand on what you feel is, why do you feel they're to do with entropy?
Less with these more drawn ones, but for example, with your, let's say, classical playgrounds, there's a sense of kind of melting and falling apart that to me, and you were saying also when you were talking about the still life earlier that you sort of gave it a crescent tinge, and it feels like decay and entropy is something that's very present in what you make, and I just wondered where that came from, and to what extent, sort of where you find the beauty in the decay, or if that's actually just something that's a complete byproduct and isn't in your head at all, which might also be the case.
I think one of the points I'm trying to make is nothing stands still. That we as individuals, the Earth, as a planet, nothing stands still. It's impossible for something to stand still because we're made of atoms and the atoms are moving and they're decaying and they're altering all the time. So much that we like to believe our lives are solid and structured and our bodies are these unchangeable things. They're not. We're continually decaying from the day we're born to the day we die. Just the decay gets slightly more obvious as you get older, obviously. And I'm trying to enjoy that fact. I'm saying that this is a wonderful thing because, to some extent, it makes us all immortal. Because we don't disappear, we just change into something else. And you could say that, well, that's quasi-religious understanding of us, but maybe it is. Maybe it's saying that, you know, this figure is melting and turning into meat and decaying, and we're all the living dead, really, because our futures are as just being a hunk of meat in the end, being buried or cremated. That's already set out for us. And this is an enjoyable thing, because it means, you know, and change is good. We're always transforming into something new. You know, we'll get buried or burnt and we turn into a tree or a worm or a bird, and that's interesting. It would be nice if there were slightly more trees and birds for us to turn into when we die, but that's a different subject. But yes, the idea that in a lot of these works is that alteration and fluidity and flow is continuous. Everything is moving, everything is in flux, and that you're never quite sure what you're looking at either. You don't know whether you're looking at paint or whether you're looking at flesh. You don't know whether you're looking at whose leg you're looking at or whose face. You don't know whether you're looking at through a figure or at the surface of the figure, because there's a certain translucency built into everything I make. That, yes, you're made unsure and everything is meant to be a bit tricky and fluid and changeable. And that's exactly the point I'm trying to make in a lot of the work, that nothing stands still.
I don't want it. Merci beaucoup en tout cas de votre patience.